Hello and welcome to this special edition of World Roundup on France 24 as historian and resistance fighter Marc Bloch enters the Pantheon, a rare tribute reserved for the country's most revered historical figures. In his lifetime, he revolutionised the study of history and was decorated for bravery after fighting in the First World War. The historian of Jewish heritage was mobilised again during the Second World War and was tortured and executed by the Gestapo just 10 days after Allied forces landed in Normandy in 1944. Well, tonight's ceremony at the Pantheon is celebrating his intellectual legacy and his role in the fight against the Nazis, as France 24's James Andre reports.
Well, Emmanuel Macron chose to honour Marc Bloch for a variety of reasons. The first of which is probably that he chose France. He was from the region of Alsace. His father had fled after the Germans took control of it after the war in 1871. Then Marc Bloch went on to study history and then fight in the First World War. When Alsace was liberated from the Germans, he decided to move back there. That is where, with a group of young teachers, he went back to the university and basically reformed it, Frenchized it, and indeed created a new current, a new way of studying history, a way that includes not only the big dates and the big names, but also looks at the day-to-day life of the peoples in time. He was an expert of the Middle Ages and really marked his speciality. Then when the Second World War broke out, well, he was 56, but still decided to go and fight. He defined himself as someone who enjoyed or liked the front line, liked the action, someone who wanted to always be useful to his country, and that is very much what he did during that Second World War. And then, when indeed France was occupied by the Germans, well, he decided to join the resistance. There he had a very important role in coordinating the guerrilla movement in Lyon. That actually got him arrested by the French police that then handed him to the Nazis, who executed him on the 18th of June 1944, just 10 days after the Allied D-Day, which was to liberate France. So it is really a man who both chose France, physically fought and defended it, but also was a great intellectual. And in that sense, he is in the direct line of the 5 other people that indeed Emmanuel Macron chose to place at the Pantheon.
France 24's James Andre reporting from outside the Pantheon a little earlier. Well, we will be crossing live to the ceremony itself. The French president is due to speak to those assembled there in the next few minutes. But before that, let's bring in Andrew Smith, lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary University of London. Thanks so much, Andrew, for being with us on the programme. We heard a little bit there from James about just what made this man so special. He may not be as well known as previous figures who've entered at the Pantheon here in Paris. Tell us, who exactly was he? Why is he considered one of the most important historians of the 20th century?
Thank you. I think it is absolutely crucial to view Marc Bloch as, a historian and not only a hero. He was someone whose study of medieval history was extraordinarily influential. He was somebody that showed us really not just the history of feudal regimes. Of course, he wrote Feudal Society, one of his very famous works. It was not just about how the institutions worked. It wasn't just about the actual the kings and queens, but about how societies held together. He was someone who crossed disciplines, who worked with new emerging fields of sociology, for example. He was someone who saw the importance of working across national boundaries, for whom Europe meant something. But he was also someone, I think, who was extraordinarily committed to the idea that history, the science of men and time, was something that could be projected forwards, that had to speak to the present moment. He was someone for whom the study of the past could never just be, flat data and all the rest of it. It's someone had to be framed with an understanding of the present. And I think that's one of the reasons why he became so extraordinarily influential. He was, of course, one of the founders of the Annales School, a hugely influential field in social history, but likewise someone who fought for France in uniform, and in the mind and on the page, someone who valued the Republic, someone who called it necessary, just, someone who saw it as being the lifeblood of what France could be. We heard that he chose France. Indeed, he fought for France, and ultimately he died for France, for an idea of a republic, for an idea of a belief in truth. Of course, he wrote a lot about belief, not just about, saying what people believed or why they believed it, but how belief functioned, how these myths could motivate societies, how they could draw us together. But he also issued quite dire warnings about the threats of the complacency of elites, the need for the patriotic duty to tell the truth about the national past, and to acknowledge the complexity that faces us all. So I think that's part of the reason why he's so important. He's an extraordinarily important historian, citizen, and hero of the Republic.
And Andrew, we've been watching a symbolic casket being carried into the Pantheon there in live images coming to us directly. The historian himself, he's buried, of course, in a village cemetery in central France, and he won't be physically interred there in the Pantheon. But how do you think his experiences during the two world wars helped to kind of shape his thinking and his whole philosophy?
I think it's an important statement of his belief in sort of courageously recognising the necessities of the present. He served in the First World War in uniform. He, of course, served again in the Second. He was someone that absolutely did his Republican duty. I think that emphasised to him that he could be, in later years when he faced repression, unfortunately, because of laws put in place by the French state, collaborationist laws in which he lost his position, in which he lost his property. He put himself at the service of the resistance and put his mind at the service of the resistance and his body. He was someone that wrote some of his greatest works in that final moment, and an observer of what had gone wrong with France, the France that he loved, the Republic that he valued above all. And I think what he saw in these things, this strange defeat, as he called it, was both an unflinching look at what failed France, of course, a partial one written in the moment about, high with feeling, high with emotion, but an attempt to offer a kind of observation and a warning to the future as well. And when he eventually was arrested and rounded up, it was sadly by Frenchmen, by collaborationists that handed him over eventually to be killed. There was, in Paris at the time, the collaborationist newspapers printed his name amongst this kind of nest of resistance that had been smashed. So it's a reminder, I think, that service in service of France, in service of the Republic, is a really stark reminder about the fragility of those values and the importance of fighting for them and fighting for what those values mean and being an unflinching critic where they have drifted.
And his entrance into the Pantheon, if you can put it like that, it has been talked about for years, really, by, if we go back as far as French President Nicolas Sarkozy was debating it when he was in power. Why is this the right moment, do you think, for this recognition to be bestowed?
I think there are a number of reasons why this absolutely pertinent, moment, this absolutely pertinent ceremony, this absolutely pertinent mark of respect is being paid to Marc Bloch. He is, representative of his background. He is, brought in as an intellectual, as a historian, as a Jewish man that chose France, as a victim of France's failures, as somebody who stood up for what is great about France. I think there are pressing moments right now that call for that type of recognition. We face a crisis in truth in the face of experts. People need to understand the fragility of Republican structures. Of course, we've seen, only in the last couple of years, the extraordinary turbulence in French Republican structures and the kind of stress testing of the Constitution of the Fifth Republic. But we also, I think, need to recognize crises of anti-Semitism, the need to stand up, to look where minorities are persecuted. This is absolutely a statement that we need to remember to stand up for those Republican values of all citizens and stand up really for the evidence and the need to examine truth. As we said before, not just institutions, but how societies are held together. And so I think this is an important moment. It's not just a historian, someone engaged in memory being brought into the Pantheon, but somebody who is part now of the nation's memory. And that difficult past, the way that the French state failed Marc Bloch, this is not a kind of recompense for that, but it's a marker of that, of the complexity of that historical moment. And I think that's really the important message right now. Bloch believed that the love of country begins with intellectual honesty about its failures. And I think there is a really important moment to look at the fragility of the Republic, at a crisis of truth and a need to protect some of the very fragile structures of the Republic.
And of course, this honour coming less than a year before presidential elections here in France, it's likely to be the last time we see Emmanuel Macron presiding over such a ceremony. Does all of that add to its political significance, do you think, Andrew?
Absolutely. I think, like every president, Macron uses the Pantheon to express a vision of France. And I think that choice of Marc Bloch emphasises a France defined by knowledge, by civic courage, by resistance to tyranny, but also kind of fidelity to democratic values, a respect for, what that actually represents. But I also think it's an attempt by Emmanuel Macron to once again reach for this language of resistance. Emmanuel Macron has repeatedly used quotes from Marc Bloch. He's invoked his image in speeches. Of course, he did so when he dissolved the French Parliament to such disastrous effect. And he's used it as a way to try and kind of cast aspersions on both left and right, and actually sometimes created some of that chaos that he feared, sometimes falling in, I think, to the complacency of elites that Marc Bloch called out in his book on the strange defeat. So I think Emmanuel Macron is reaching for this as a communication with France's legacy, with a vision of France, and with a vision of the French Republic, trying to communicate these positive values. But once again, I think he's invoking the image of Marc Bloch, the image of resistance, the image of what France can represent, to communicate some of the dangers of the extremes, and perhaps to communicate to the French people the danger of the extremes at the ballot box as well.
Yeah, and Marine Le Pen notably not on the invitation list. The historian's ideas, Andrew, as well, they've been used by politicians on the right, on the far right, as recently as last year by Jordan Bardella himself. Is there broad consensus, more generally speaking, about the pantheonization, if we can use that term, of this historian? Or was there any kind of debate about whether or not he should be given this honour?
I haven't seen anyone really offering an opinion that this is not in any way suitable. I think it's absolutely something that's deserved. It's extraordinary. This is, really one of the first historians entering the Pantheon. And that says something about France's commitment to the discipline in a statement in a difficult moment in many universities across the world. In my own country, in the UK, history needs to be stood up for. We need to make the case for the value of history, for the value of young people to study how the past matters to the present, to learn those habits of historical thinking. We might look at something like one of his masterpieces on the historian's.
I'm sorry
not just a handbook.
Apologies for cutting across you there, but we're just about to hear from Emmanuel Macron.
16th of June, 1944. As night was falling, in a field around Lyon, the Nazis executed their prisoners, 30 men from various professions, faiths and beliefs, a carpenter, a trade unionist, a railway worker, Poles, members of the resistance, communists, and amongst them a history teacher, a professor of history, Marc Bloch. In that field, Marc Bloch lived very much as he had lived amongst others, ready to share in the ideals of others and understanding their lives. It was a heroic death because it was a stoic death, a death he had got ready for when he had been injured on the front 29 years previously. Lucien Febvre, his friend, said it was a holy death, a death that was challenged and spoken ill of because he had resisted against the Nazi occupier and Vichy. When the enemy occupied France as of June 1940, when the government under Pétain and Laval engaged in collaboration, his destiny changed, as did the destiny and the fate of all the Jews. He was a true Republican, a promoter and defender of secularism, and yet Marc Bloch suffered the consequences of state anti-Semitism under Marshal Pétain's government. But little did Vichy's men value Marc Bloch's life and ideals. They only focused on the fact that he was Jewish, and yet he had fought in 1914, had the Croix de Guerre, was a member of the Legion of Honor, had fought in the 1939-1940 campaign, had joined the forces aged more than 50. He had studied at the École Normale Supérieure, taught at Strasbourg, wrote the Healing Kings and the Feudal Society, created a learned review with his friend Lucien Febvre. But little did that count for. The men working for the État français only saw in Marc Bloch a Jew, the evil Jew, someone who was guilty because Jew, who deserved to be excluded, persecuted because he was Jewish. At the end of 1940, Marc Bloch, as so many of our fellow citizens, bore the consequences of this policy, as did his family. He was excluded from the university he was teaching at. His pay and pension was suspended. His bank accounts were blocked. His Paris flat was requisitioned. He had then to leave the northern part of France that was occupied by the Nazis. He fled to the so-called free area in France, and from there Marc Bloch said he was Jewish, claimed he was Jewish, did not hide, and fought as he could against state sanctions anti-Semitism following the two pieces of legislation passed in 1941. Marc Bloch fought his first battle against Vichy and the Nazis. He erred and went from his house in Fougères, then Montpellier and Lyon, and they went through his library. The Vichy authorities and Nazi occupiers wanted to confiscate his library, a library of 5,000 books that he had collected over his career, a library that illustrates his yearning, his passion for literature, his yearning for education and knowledge. And Marc Bloch resisted. He did not want to give up his books, give up his life, give up what gave meaning to his life. He asked Lucien Febvre to use all his contacts. He turned to people who worked with Pétain but who had known his father and studied under him. He was asking simply to be able to keep his books. That was all he was asking for him and for his children. And yet, that was impossible. He was subjected to the evil of others. Anti-Semitism had deprived him of his profession and his resources, and he was now being deprived of his books, which were sent to Germany and scattered. Marc Bloch's case clearly illustrates that whenever you turn against Jews, there's always a préfet ordering the police, there's always a policeman to go, a judge to authorize the action, a journalist to comment positively on it, and so many others ready to turn their gaze away from it. And we should never forget this. All of this happened. An ideological approach and structure of hatred appeared, and yet a few of them, there were a few of them who were ready to bring back France to life and fight for its resurrection. There was a préfet, Jean Moulin, who organized the underground armies on behalf of de Gaulle. Achille Peretti, a policeman, set up a network. Paul Didier, a judge, did not swear loyalty to Pétain. Pierre-Henri Tedjen joined a network, and Pierre Dac, a journalist, poked fun at the occupier, and even people who joined and who became just amongst the nations, and 1,038 young men who fought and became companions of the liberation. Marc Bloch is a member of that chain that saves us, that saved us, an heir to the Enlightenment, a veteran of both wars who went and fought along the army of shadows. He went and joined the Francs-Tireurs network, joining at 57. Maurice Spessy was only 20 and the head of the network. And Marc Bloch said, I am his, learning everything from him. He's now known as Maurice Blanchard or Mr. Rollin or Chevreuse or Narbonne. That is him now. He is a member of Jean Moulin's committee of experts alongside François de Menton, Alexandre Parodi, Michel Debré, and so many others. And together they start thinking about France, a free France, a France that has been liberated. And he is the regional leader of the network. He realizes how great the risk he, his wife, Simone, and his children are running. And he was arrested on the 8th of March 1944 on La Boucle Bridge in Lyon, arrested by French members of the Gestapo working under Klaus Barbie. And he was locked up at Montluc prison, as Jean Moulin had been, as a prisoner of the so-called Gueule Tordue. He was tortured, waterboarded 7 times, and only gave the names of those he knew to be safely in London. He behaved as a history teacher, of course, always and everywhere. He is a prisoner that is and remains calm and cheerful. One of his companions said he would encourage us, tell us about France, about its past, and never despaired. He was handed over to the Nazis and murdered with his companions in the evening of the 16th of June, 1944. The Vichy propaganda speak of him as a terrorist because he was Jew. Milice Darlan, the head of the militia, spoke of him, he who was fighting for the Vichy government even though it was collapsing and the war was being lost by them. That is where and what anti-Semitism leads us to, as soon as people engage along that dark path. having to face this nightmare. Now, Marc Bloch's greatness is that he never despaired and never gave up on France, on the French. His acts of resistance are also that he wrote and thought. As a historian, and history is a struggle, and seeing as Vichy had deprived him of his books, he wrote more books. Books involved in a fight, in true resistance. He wrote Apologie pour l'Histoire and The Strange Defeat. Julien Febvre, as he wrote to Julien Febvre, we are the unfortunate victims of this strange defeat. Historians have, as he says, to turn and be active because of the past. I believed in the future because I was writing it myself, he said. That is how that book, that strange defeat, occurred. He looks at writing this history of the present day, looking at all the causes of the failure of 1940. In so doing, he teaches us to look at how we went from the joyful France of 1936 and the Front Populaire and the collapse of France in May 1940. He looks at the elites who gave in to despair and defeat, giving up on the people. He is very severe in passing judgment on Blum and his government, but even more so when looking at the other French who were eager to get power and authorities, looking at Hitler with yearning, these people who did not see that France was not as low as they thought it was. And these are always the first to give up on France, on the interest of France, the first who will to betray her and to sacrifice the people of France, a free people that deep down they do not love. That is how the spirit of defeat that goes hand in hand with Vichy came about. A spirit that we have to fight against always. Something that went against the principles of freedom, equality and fraternity. Something that had now given up on understanding the complexities of the world and had given up on the people of France. Marc Bloch was an unquiet intellectual. He is this testament to our life, to their life, for indeed he cannot be separated from Simone, his love, his true love, his real victory. Not to mention his children, Alice, Louis, Etienne, Daniel, who became members of the resistance, and Jean and Daniel. He breathed into his children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren, this sense of the republic, of the country, this sense of duty and action. He leaves us knowledge and science. His library, his books were scattered by the Germans, but his knowledge and approach bore fruit and gave rise to other scientists and scholars who are so interested in the future and in history, as Marco Ginsburg. In his book on history and the profession of a historian, he mentioned this sentence, Daddy, what is history for? But with an inspiration drawn from his own father, he applied the scientific method to history, to his understanding of social and religious relations. History, as he put it, is the science of men in time. It is not a succession of events triggered by individuals, however exceptional they may be, but it is a construct over the long period, over time. As a medieval historian, he considered that what the little people, the little folk of France did was just as valuable as what the kings did, as he showed in his book on the healing kings. The job of a historian is to contextualize and to understand these things that become a truth. And it is in this understanding, in what Lucien Febvre calls this mental toolkit, that you can establish truth in history, a truth that is built on evidence, on analysis, something that is then refined over historiography. Dilexit veritatem, he loved truth. This is both an epitaph and a guiding principle. Thus, Marc Bloch established a bond between France, history, republic, and governance. This method, this link, are the best ways still today to fight against historic revisionism that we can see rear its ugly head in so many places. Indeed, Marc Bloch, who was a teenager during the Dreyfus affair, realizes that history, it must be about science and justice. It must be distinct from easy beliefs. Intellectual integrity always goes hand in hand with moral strength and physical strength. Science and resistance is what this is all about. You have also the testament of a teacher. As the son of a teacher, he never gave up teaching, never, ever. Whether he was teaching at Strasbourg University or in Montluc prison, he took to the podium and taught easy lessons, being optimistic. I believe in young people, he said. And teaching history means turning to our young people always and everywhere. This is an everlasting testament that he gives us always and everywhere. Marc Bloch, therefore, enters the Pantheon alive, here, with us. His heritage, as he put it, is that France will always be the motherland that will be in my heart. I drank from its life-giving water. I took its history on board, and I feel well here, and I tried to defend it as best I could.
Vive Marc Bloch.
Long live Marc Bloch. Long live Simone Bloch. Long live Republic. Long live France.
To the Enlightenment, who was subjected to the evil, hatred and anti-Semitism of others, but who loved truth and never gave up on his country. We've been listening there to the French president pay tribute to resistance fighter and historian Marc Bloch during a special ceremony at the Pantheon. Tortured and executed by the Gestapo in 1944, he has now become the first historian to enter the Pantheon, an honour reserved for the most exceptional figures from the worlds of politics, culture and science. Well, Andrew Smith, lecturer in liberal arts at Queen Mary, University of London, is still with us. We spoke a little earlier, Andrew, just about the significance of this moment about who exactly Marc Bloch was. But given the current geopolitical context, why is it important to honour these figures who combine scholarship with resistance to oppression? I think it was something Macron himself touched on during that speech.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I think, what President Macron is asking us to do there is to kind of broaden that idea of resistance beyond just wartime resistance, beyond just a fact of history, but instead to, invite listeners, to invite people to see resistance as a kind of democratic virtue, the willingness to defend fundamental principles under pressure. It's inviting us to see ideas of critical inquiry, not as a luxury, but a civic necessity. And I think that's something that's really important. We live in a moment where there is war in Europe. We live in a moment where there is global conflict, where we see these kind of crises of authoritarianism, of democratic backsliding, where there are concerns about democracy, about education, about truth, about citizenship, about anti-Semitism. These are crises in the moment right now. And I think that's a really important message. Marc Bloch is not entering the Pantheon because he died for France, but because he taught France, and I think he taught all of us, historians and everyone else, that freedom, that ideas of citizenship depend on that disciplined search for truth. I was saying how the idea of the historian's craft, we could see it as a handbook for historians. We can see it as something we take and show to our students to talk about how to write history. But we can also see it as a form of democratic manifesto when we're faced with crises of authoritarianism, when we're facing up to those challenges, where actually things like these democratic values, the Republican values that President Macron is defending, seem so very fragile. And that, I think, is something that is really important and signifies the importance of what Marc Bloch stands for in this moment right now.
And Emmanuel Macron also referring to how he believed in young people. Do you think his story still resonates with younger generations who may know little about the resistance, Andrew?
I think it should. I think it will. I think it becomes part of a story of the French nation. Inducting Marc Bloch into the Pantheon inducts him into the memory of the nation. It encourages people to ask that question. It will encourage them in schools up and down the country to encounter perhaps his work for the first time, to encounter that story about fighting in the Marne and the Somme, about fighting to defend France against the Germans, about fighting to save France from itself, and ultimately falling victim to the worst moments of what happened during the war. I think that's the kind of story that will speak to young people up and down the country, to alert them to these challenges where they see around them problems around truth, problems around critical thinking. They need to understand, I think, that this represents really a challenge to learn, to defend, to actually come to understand those habits of historical thinking, that critical thinking, that inquiry, that scientific pursuit of the truth. Not to take, if we talk about the royal touch, the idea that kings are magic and heal people as a fact, but to understand, if we question that belief, if we understand the function of that belief, if we understand why it holds societies together, then we come closer to understanding what that society was. That's a challenge for every young person, and it's an invitation to learn more about their past, to study history, and to bring that thinking to the very, very urgent moment that we face right now in the present.
And Andrew, just a little more broadly speaking, what does it mean in practical and symbolic terms to actually enter the Pantheon? And what does this particular choice reveal about the values that France wants to emphasise today?
Entering the Pantheon is, something that has, every time someone is brought into the Pantheon, it tells us something about the present as well as the past. We've seen this in Macron's term with Simon Veil, with Misak Ménician, with these kind of values that are represented in terms of saying what the Republic sees in itself, who it counts amongst its number of heroes, who it sees as exemplars of those Republican values. And I think what we see here is really a message that France is saying it values its historians, it values its resistors, it integrates that Jewish presence into French history. And it says actually all of these things are about understanding the complexities of history and the need to continuously confront those complexities in defense of the political present. So I think there's a lot of messages tied up within this about kind of really tying this into a national narrative, into the roman national, the national novel that says what the Republic is and what it can be. As we heard President Macron say, this is as much a story about belief in the future, about, even in those final moments, Marc Bloch's belief that the future was being written in the present by those who study the past, by those whose careful inquiry brings together the difficult truths and tells us much more about ourselves than we might otherwise learn with cozy beliefs and easy assumptions. This, I think, is a very, very pressing message for right now.
Finally, Andrew, if Marc Bloch could witness the ceremony himself, what aspect of his life do you think he'd be most proud to see remembered?
I think ultimately we can say that motto written on the side of the giant banner, which talked about that love for truth, that idea of his scholarship, that idea that he's held up as being someone that values the Republic, but also someone that was inducted and honoured alongside his family. He was someone that died for France, someone that fought for France, someone that fought for all of those values of the Republic, of his family, of his background and his beliefs, someone that stood up for all of those things in that moment. I think that quest for truth is ultimately what we can use to define Marc Bloch's legacy.
Andrew, we leave it there for now. Thank you so much for all your time on the programme this evening. That's Andrew Smith, Lecturer in Liberal Arts at Queen Mary, University of London, joining us there as Marc Bloch enters the Pantheon.